Welcome AP Psych friends to our second video for Unit 8A on motivation and emotion. We're going to continue talking about hunger, but rather than focusing on more of the physiology of hunger, we're going to talk about psychological elements as well and kind of build on what we did in our first video in our class discussion. Okay, so the psychology of hunger. The first thing to discuss is taste preferences. And so what draws us to eat certain foods and not others? I mean, sure, we can talk about individual preferences towards things, but even those individual preferences could be guided by both our biology and our culture as a whole. And so we know, biologically speaking, that in times of stress, people tend to prefer carbohydrates because of the release of extra feel-good serotonin in the brain upon eating carbs. We know from Unit 6 on learning that taste aversion is based on our biological predispositions, that we could learn to avoid a particular food because it made us ill or is dangerous for us. So that's biology at work. We also know that we have a biological desire for things that contain salt. And again, salt was very much in our ancestors' past an important element to our survival, but a rarity. And so biology could explain why there are people that like too much salt means they become, I don't want to say addicted, but need this desire for excess salt. And so biology, like our biological makeup, plays a role in what we normally in everyday life just think is individual preferences. Culture plays a role too as well. The culture in which you are raised probably affects the preferences you have towards specific tastes. What you were raised eating might be what you prefer to eat. But our environment can play a role too. And I kind of lumped that under culture. This concept of social facilitation is important to remember, and that it's our natural tendency to eat in the presence of others. That could explain why did some serious overeating over the holidays, right, at all those parties I attended. And so, being mindful of that it is an important thing to do. One other thing related, I guess, to the cultural element is what's known as unit bias, and that when given larger portions, people tend to pack it in. And so culturally, Americans are very much all about an overabundance of food. Right? Supersize me. It's a problem in our culture. And other cultures that have skinnier waistlines than we do, culturally might have, frown upon things like large sizes of things. Asking for seconds in America is a sign to the cook that you like what they're offering, whereas doing that in other cultures may be deemed as very rude, in that you weren't satisfied with what I gave you, and leaving a small portion of everything on your plate in some cultures is an indication that you couldn't possibly eat any more. Your host has given you plenty of food and you thank them for the overabundance, whereas in American culture we tend to still be an advocate of that clean plate club. And so taste preferences can be affected by not just our biological makeup, but our society and culture as well. One of the kind of dark sides of the psychology of hunger is an exploration of eating disorders. Anorexia nervosa is going to be characterized by extreme dieting, where the individual is losing 15% or more of their total weight, and yet is still perceiving themselves as being overweight. Bulimia nervosa is a situation where we have a person that participates in episodes of overeating, which we call binging, and then experience feelings of guilt and remorse for the binging, and relieve those feelings by purging, which could be fasting, it could be excessive exercise, it could be vomiting, it could be abuse of laxatives. Binge eating disorder is a situation where, like bulimia nervosa, an individual has episodes of binging, but their feelings of remorse are dealt with by binging again rather than purging. And so, like, why do these eating disorders exist? Like how do people psychologically overcome their biology to have an eating disorder? There could be a couple of reasons why. Environmentally, we know that a household that focuses a lot on the importance of weight can sometimes unnecessarily trigger an eating disorder. We know that children that are obese and as a result tend to have lower self-esteem are more, motivated to or gravitate towards having an eating disorder in their teens and 20s. Households that are overly competitive, that focus on being a very high achieving person and are very protective of their children can sometimes be a trigger for anorexia. We know culturally this tends to be a problem for females more so than males because of our culture's emphasis on the female physique and the fact that it has to be slender in order to be perceived as attractive or beautiful. We also know, though, that genetics can play a role, that eating disorders run in families. And so trying to identify through, identical twin studies of, twins separated at birth versus fraternal twins separated at birth, neuroscience is still trying to, and geneticists are still trying to figure out, like, genetically and chemically why some people are more prone to these than others. But they're an example of, someone's psychological processes overriding biological needs and drives. Obesity, another issue in our culture, a problem that is becoming a worldwide epidemic. The other industrialized nations are not far behind Americans in having an obesity problem. But why is it such a problem? It probably has to do with, the society we live in and the fact that evolution, our bodies don't change as quickly as our culture does. And so we know from the physiology of hunger discussion that when the body is receiving food, we have the glucose communicating that the brain, the hypothalamus dictating what sort of hormones are going to be released in the body concerning whether or not you're hungry or full. From an evolution standpoint, when you didn't have enough food, your body interpreted it as, food is a scarcity, a rarity, and we need to preserve as much energy as possible, which means that, our bodies try to store as much fat as they can when it feels like it's being starved. And so, that's why, in our own history and even in other areas of the globe, being obese is a sign of affluence and wealth, in that the majority of people couldn't afford to eat even when they weren't hungry. But that evolution means that it's going to be more difficult to lose weight than we think. And we'll talk more about that with the physiology of obesity in just a second. But social effects of obesity, we know that the perception that our culture has is that obese people are lazy, obnoxious, sloppy, and less friendly. We have lots of research where, equally intelligent women are making less money if they are obese versus their equally intelligent, slender counterparts. We also know from experiments of trained actors going on job interviews in makeup and suits that make them look obese versus going in their regular frame. The interviewers who have just literally talked to the same person will usually say that the obese person seemed less qualified for the job than the non-obese person, when in fact it was the same individual that they spoke to. And so, being obese has lots of social ramifications, and our psychological well-being can be affected by that kind of social stigma. And so, physiologically speaking, why does obesity happen? Okay, the first here is these darn fat cells that exist simply to store up energy for the times in our evolutionary past when we did not have food to sustain our energy. And so lots of times you hear this by fitness gurus that are trying to sell you something on their infomercial, or to, just everyday ignorant people. This is a simple solution, you'll hear people say. You got to burn more calories than you take in. If only it were that easy. What happens here with fat cells is that as a person becomes obese, these large fat cells tend to divide in the body, and we're not real sure how they do this, but they can even sometimes trigger neighboring fat cells to begin to divide, probably having something to do with the fact of, oh boy, we better store up as much of this as we can, in case there's not, food at a future point in time. And so once a person has increased the number of fat cells in their body, that will never go away. And some people are more biologically predisposed to do this because of genetics. People that are obese in childhood, that's why that's so dangerous, and that the number of fat cells is increased at such a young age, and that can't ever be reversed. And so when an obese person is losing weight, they're shrinking their fat cells, but the amount of fat cells has been increased, which means that they will constantly be battling this desire or this hunger to eat. It makes it very difficult. We also have issues with changing of the set point in a person's metabolism. Okay, so these fat cells need less food to maintain themselves because fat tissue works at a lower metabolic weight. And so once a person tries to diet and goes below that settling point or that set point, their body automatically is more hungry, and their metabolism automatically slows down in an attempt to preserve energy. Because the body's like, oh, we're being starved. There must not be any more food. And so that's kind of this double-edged sword to trying to hardcore diet to not be obese. I already mentioned that, but twin and adoption studies show us that there is a genetic predisposition towards, this acquisition of fat cells. We know that food choice is going to be fairly critical then, because just telling somebody that is obese, if you eat less, you will lose weight, it is an impossible goal. And so it has to be environmental. We have to change habits, and that the food that is selected needs to be healthier in nature, and not necessarily how much of it's being eaten, but what is being eaten. Look, we will always crave sugary, fatty foods. Those things are a rarity in Mother Nature, and that's why when our ancestors came across them, they'd gobble up as much of it as they could. And so we have to, in our society where all of that is so readily accessible, we have to be willing to psychologically say no, because physiologically we can't say no. Activity plays a role too. We're just less active than our ancestors, so we have to, move, get up, move around. We also know that sleep deprivation can trigger some of those hormones that we talked about. Leptin decreasing, ghrelin increasing. The body thinks it's in stress when we're not sleeping. And so sleeping is important, exercise is important, and healthy eating is important for a gradual loss of weight and overcoming the physiology of obesity. So thanks for listening, and bring any questions you have with you to class.